Now to Gaza, where Donald Trump is pushing to save the ceasefire he helped broker. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and special envoy Steve Witkoff have travelled to Israel and met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And this came a day after Israel launched a series of deadly airstrikes in Gaza in retaliation, Israel says, for Hamas attacks against Israeli troops. This latest US diplomatic intervention comes as relief agencies warn that the flood of aid promised by the truce is far from being realised.
For families living among the ruins of Gaza City, these tents are their only protection from the elements. And it's a constant struggle for survival.
First, we were displaced to Deir al-Balah. Then we came here. Since places are scarce, we were forced to settle here.
Any initial relief from the fragile ceasefire in Gaza has been short-lived for many Palestinians. Essential supplies like food, medicines, and hygiene products are still desperately needed. And with winter approaching, many fear how they will withstand the wind and rain.
They said there is a truce, and so we wanted to return to our homes. We've been humiliated while getting drinking water, finding shelter, and the brutal cold weather. We wanted to return safely, but there is no safety. This is not a life.
Israel says it's reopening 2 aid crossings into Gaza. But the UN and humanitarian groups say the volume of aid getting in is still way below what is needed, including supplies for hospitals.
We're letting children die because they need basic medications. And since this ceasefire, no additional humanitarian resources have been allocated to this hospital. So we are working with very, very limited abilities. And people are dying because humanitarian aid is not being allowed in to support our work.
They're calling for all entry points to stay open and for more deliveries of life-saving aid as soon as possible.
Rosalia Bollen speaks for the UN children's agency UNICEF. She's recently returned from Gaza and joins us now from the Netherlands. Welcome to DW. Can we start with aid supplies, which are said now to be flowing into Gaza again? What have you seen and heard from your colleagues on the ground?
Just spoke to my supply colleagues in the Gaza Strip, and they've reported that today they've picked up over 20 trucks with life-saving aid for UNICEF, and they've offloaded 20 more at the crossing for collection. So thankfully, after yesterday, the crossings did open today, and UNICEF is bringing in items such as diapers, soap, sanitary pads, medical supplies, equipment for hospitals, for neonatal intensive care unit, tents, winter clothes. We aim to give every child under the age of 10 a pair of shoes and a pair of winter clothes before the end of this year, as winter is rapidly approaching in Gaza too. So it's a good start, but the conditions inside the Gaza Strip for families remain unimaginably difficult.
20 trucks, that's UNICEF trucks, so I'm guessing those are amongst other aid going in, because we hear that you actually need sort of hundreds a day to go into the territory.
That's right. Yes, that's correct. And it is a collective effort. It has to be a collective effort between NGOs, UN agencies, the private sector, diplomatic missions, because people in Gaza do not have the basic necessities they need to survive. The needs are overwhelming. When you walk around in the Gaza Strip, it's a very post-apocalyptic landscape. Lots of the infrastructure has been damaged or even destroyed. In some areas, there's not a single building that is still standing. The vast majority of families have lost their homes. So we really need all hands on deck to bring in sufficient supplies, life-saving supplies, staple food, fresh produce, and for families to be able to survive.
So no standing buildings, winter on the way, temperatures expected to drop to around 6 to 8 Celsius, that's 43 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. How does that change in the season affect the aid priorities?
Well, it's funny because people outside of the Middle East often think when they hear the Gaza Strip, they think, oh, this very warm place. The thing is that during winter, it actually gets very nasty cold. And it's a humid cold. There's lots of rains. The first rains start this month. And Gaza is very prone to flooding. The population has been forcibly displaced to the coastal areas of the Gaza Strip, the western areas, the beach areas, and it's exactly those areas that tend to inundate. So we need lots of preparations right now, stormwater basins, we need sewage systems to be repaired, because the moment that floods start, that will exacerbate an already ongoing public health crisis. And we also know from last winter that sadly children have died of hypothermia, children have died from the cold. So it is a top priority to get shelter items, tents, tarpaulin sheets to families, and to get winter clothes, especially for children.
Right.
These tarpaulins, these shelter items have been stuck for a long time. They weren't authorized into the Gaza Strip. That is not the case today, at least for UNICEF. We are able to bring in some tents. We've started to bring in some tents and tarpaulins, but we need scale.
Right.
We need large quantities.
And you're able to resume the supply of aid supplies because of this ceasefire that was announced last week. But there have been more than 80 Palestinian deaths since this latest deal was announced. How does the lack of a stable peace during a ceasefire affect the work of agencies such as yours?
Especially yesterday was extremely difficult for Palestinian families and for my own colleagues. This morning, colleagues reporting that the night was scary because the sound of drones had returned. They could hear the very intense buzzing of drones above their shelters pretty much throughout the Gaza Strip. So that was terrifying, and it's heartbreaking because the children that we have been speaking to over the past 10 days, like 9-year-old Sundus, she told us that she hopes the war will never come back and that it's gone forever. And that's what many of the children that we've spoken to express. So it's heartbreaking that these hopes may be dashed. And sadly, families have been disappointed before. It's key that the ceasefire holds. It's also important because a famine was determined to be taking place in Gaza City, specifically at the end of August. In UNICEF, we monitor malnutrition rates, and we've seen a very sharp increase in malnutrition cases in July, August, and September. There's
Right.
tens of thousands of children who need assistance. So we cannot afford for the crossings to close again. They need to be open, all of them, all possible crossings into Gaza, and they need to be open simultaneously, given how high the needs are.
Understood. Thank you so much for sparing us your time and talking us through that. Rosalia Bollen from UNICEF. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Alexandra Saieh is Head of Global Strategic Influencing and Policy with the NGO Save the Children. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW. The Kerem Shalom border crossing between Israel and the Gaza Strip reopened for aid deliveries today. How does this change Gaza's humanitarian situation?
Thank you for having me. Look, it's welcome that the Kerem Shalom crossing has opened, but what we need to see is for all of the crossing points into Gaza to open and for humanitarian assistance to be allowed in without restrictions. As you can see, there are immense needs in Gaza. Almost every building is destroyed. Over the last several months, there hasn't been sufficient food entering Gaza. Hospitals were completely depleted of medical supplies. So we need everything to enter Gaza: tents, medicine, equipment to clear the rubble from the streets. more food, clean water, all of that is needed. And the needs are so immense that we need a minimum of 600 trucks a day to go in, but even that is not enough. What we need to see is consistency and predictability in terms of what goes in and how much of it goes in.
All right, and just to be clear, as far as you can tell, are all crossings into Gaza now open?
They're not all open yet for
and this is
cargo supplies.
This is despite this ceasefire deal.
Yes, and so what we need to see is all of them opened and for aid to continue to flow in. That is what's needed at the moment.
Okay, so how long? So at the current rate then, how long will it take for I was going to say some semblance of normality, but the sort of the pre-war normality. How long will it take for that to be re-established? Because, of course, Gaza was living on aid even before this war.
Exactly. Even before this, 80% of people in Gaza were surviving off of humanitarian assistance. Look, it's going to take years to rebuild Gaza. We still don't even have the basics in place. People are returning back to the rubble of their destroyed homes. They're pitching up tents where they can next to their homes, if they're even able to access it. My colleague was telling me that just driving from Deir el-Bella in central Gaza to Khan Yunis, she saw every single building destroyed. So we cannot underestimate how long it's going to take to rebuild Gaza. And in addition to that, Gaza is littered with unexploded ordnance, so that makes it very difficult to move around. So these are some of the challenges that is still impeding the ability for humanitarian assistance to not just enter Gaza, but to be distributed inside Gaza. The injuries and the other threats to children in Gaza are also still there. We're talking about children who have suffered life-debilitating injuries, and these injuries are compounding the other experiences that they have had through this war. My colleague Dan was just talking about how he met a boy named Amir who lost his father and home in an airstrike, and then later on had his legs broken and now is in a wheelchair. And that comes on top of other experiences that he has had and needs, significant mental health support. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Right. That's just one story. But these are the things that we are seeing in Gaza right now.
OK, thank you for talking us through that, Alexandra. We wish you well with your work. Alexandra Saieh from Save the Children.
Thank you for having me.
Kate Newton is Deputy Country Director for the World Food Programme in Gaza and joins us now from Jerusalem. Kate, we're hearing that aid is flowing back into the Gaza Strip. Can you tell us more?
Yes, so that's correct. We're managing to start the scale-up that we've been waiting for a long time. And already we've managed to move more than 500 trucks into Gaza. However, the situation is clearly very fragile, and we're just desperately hoping that the ceasefire is going to hold.
Now, as you say, the ceasefire was indeed unstable over the weekend, to say the least. How is that complicating the work of aid groups such as yours?
Well, we do need some level of predictability. For a long time, we've been hoping that we would have adequate security to be able to get into the Gaza Strip and to be able to move across it with some level of guaranteed safety. We have seen a slight improvement since the ceasefire in the way that our convoys are able to move, but we do still lack an adequate number of border crossing points. We're still only able to move into the south. At the moment, we cannot move into the north of the Strip. There is no border crossing point in the north. So we're very much hoping that we'll be given access into the north. And in the south, we have 2 border crossing points, but we could really use more. We would be able to move a lot more aid into Gaza if we had more border crossing points.
Now, what are the most pressing needs of the civilian population in Gaza right now?
Well, I think obviously people have been without any sustained assistance for more than 2 years, and they've been facing the most horrific humanitarian situation, a huge amount of displacement. We look at the food side, so we know that there is a nutrition crisis. We've been flagging that for a long time. There's a real shortage of food across the Gaza Strip still. It is improving, but we would like to be able to get more food in. We're managing to start to supply the bakeries. We're supplying about 10 bakeries at the moment, but we could quickly increase that to 30 if we had enough supplies. And we're also really keen to be able to scale up the nutrition response. We are managing to get to both vulnerable women and to children across the Strip, but we could do a lot more if we were able to get more supplies in quickly.
Now, winter is around the corner. Are you and other aid groups prepared to help people on the ground to get through that?
Yes, absolutely. So we work in collaboration with many other humanitarian agencies and with NGOs, and all of them are thinking about winter at the moment and how to help people to prepare, because obviously the majority of people, unfortunately, are still living in tents without homes, and they really need to be able to have adequate shelter for the winter, and also other essential things just for human survival, like water and sanitation, a basic level of healthcare. And so all of that we support. We work in coordination across the UN through the UN logistics cluster, which helps us to bring in all kinds of items, not just food, but anything that people need. So again, just having safe access to as many border points and as roads as possible, and that allows us to be able to move on behalf of the humanitarian community.
Kate Newton there, the Deputy Country Director for the World Food Programme in Gaza. Thank you very much.
Thank you.